Hey guys, welcome back to the Fairway Performance Podcast. Today I'm joined by John Novosel from Tour Tempo. John and I were introduced by a mutual friend up in Orlando at the PGA show a couple of weeks ago while he was working actually at the Bushnell booth and was very kind and helped me out with a bit of a rangefinder up there. So that was super nice of you to do. And he's joining us on the podcast today to talk about Tour Tempo and all the work that he's doing over there. So did you want to say hi to the listeners, John, and give us a rundown of who you are and what Tour Tempo is all about?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for having me on. I've been in the golf business. We were just talking forever. And my dad and I started Tour Tempo, way in the year 2000, basically. And we had done training aids and stuff before that. I think the other thing to just mention is that I've always been into speed and I've always been into the fitness side. And that, I don't want to say I was ahead of my time, but it kind of was. I mean, that didn't become a thing until Tiger really hit the scene hard and that type of things. But that's a little bit of a background on me, and excited to dig into this today.
Yeah, mate. Well, did you just want to tell a bit of a story? Like, what was it that you were doing, all those years ago, training wise, and what made you say that you're a bit ahead of the time? Like, what stuff were you doing back in the day? I'm sure some of it was probably really good, and some of it was probably because there's no research about it. Some was probably like really bad, and you learnt the hard way. But what were the things that you were doing early doors when you first started out?
I just remember being in high school, and this was in the 80s, well, 87 at least, that, I wanted to hit my 9-iron 150 yards. I knew if I could hit the ball farther, I was going to shoot lower scores. And I didn't have any, obviously, data or anything like that. And, at the time on tour, it was Greg Norman and Fred Couples, and there was nobody really dominating that was a long hitter. My dad had invented this training aid. We still have it. It's called the Speedball, and it was a resistance pad that you hit into. It was made of Velcro, and it gave you this resistance at impact. And we didn't have any data on it, but, as I dug more deep into everything I did, and this being a trainer and doing what you do, the body needs a resistance. The body needs a demand. And if you place a demand on the body, then it's gonna adapt. And that's kind of that was my early MO, and it's been my MO my entire life, is how can I create an adaptation? What is the increased demand I'm going to put on the body to create that adaptation? But in the process of doing all this, I was working out, which golfers really didn't do back then, that type of stuff, and using this training aid my dad developed. But as we got into the Tour Tempo piece of it, and when he created that and I helped him develop it, we realized that tempo could be used for speed and power as well.
Yeah, that's so cool. It's a scientific principle. It's called the SAID principle, specific adaptations for imposed demands. Yeah, so it's in literature these days. So we know that we need to have some sort of stimulus on the body if we're going to create a certain adaptation. So we need to move quickly if we want to move fast, or we need to move heavy with the intent to move quickly if we want to move faster. So there needs to be some sort of stress on the body to create the adaptation that we want. So in saying that, like, what were you seeing like in the early days, like 87? It'll probably make you feel old. That was literally when I was born. But what were you seeing?
Yeah. I mean, keep in mind that was like my freshman year of college. So So I mean, back then the training for golf was in its infancy, and it was mainly bands and things of that nature. And what you saw, and you still see today, and I'm sure you see this, is the problem with bands and things like that is that typically they're not going to create enough of a stimulus on the body to do you any good. It depends on how you're using them and what you're doing, obviously. But we've got to create that stimulus. And also everything looked very golfy. It had to look kind of like a golf swing. And I started, as I developed and realized, hey, I don't need this to look like a golf swing. I just need to move better, be a stronger, better, more fit, more powerful athlete. Let's do that first, and let's do the golf training separately over here. Granted, they're intertwined, but the exercises don't have to look golfy. And that was a big thing that we started to figure out and learn. And let's let the mechanics of the swing, do what I need to do. But the actual working out in the gym, let's just build a better athlete. And I think that still holds true today.
Yeah, 100%. All the guys that I start with in the phases that I work them through, the foundations, we don't do anything that really resembles a golf swing. There's some rotational work, but it's all unilateral work to even out sides of the body, because we know that if we are evening out the sides, for golf being a very one-sided sport, if we're building muscle, that increases our power potential, because if we've got more muscle mass, Essentially, it's why they have different weight classes in sports, because someone with more muscle can create more
Exactly.
power. It's just a thing. And if we've got more range of motion, so more range of motion in the key areas, which is the hips, the thoracic, and the shoulders. So if we can move better in those three spots and have more muscle mass and be stronger through those ranges of motion, then that just equals the potential to swing the club much, much quicker. So then once we get down the route of further into training, obviously we can do some more like, the sexy, cool stuff that we see like JT and Scotty do at, the stable in Jupiter and we're at Naples in Florida or whatever they do there. But, they've done the foundational work that a lot of the average golfers have not done. But so obviously you're talking about training there, and then you and your dad sort of stumbled across tempo helping out with the swing speed and your potential on the course. How did that come about? Like, tell us a little bit about that. Was it just like one day you just sort of like tripped and fell on top of it and you're like, oh shit, like this is actually working? Like, what should we do here?
No, it is a great story.
Science.
And it was discovered totally by accident. But back then, you didn't have Instagram or social media. You did an infomercial on the Golf Channel. That was like the big deal to do an infomercial. Your listeners probably barely remember what those are, but that was sort of the big thing. And when we were editing that infomercial, and this was before, again, back then nobody had editing equipment or any of this stuff. But when we were editing that infomercial, we saw, and the infomercial was for that speedball product. So it was to hit the ball farther. We had Jan Stevenson. Isn't she Australian? I think she's an Aussie. Jan Stevenson.
Heard the name.
You don't even know who she is.
Time.
She won the Women's U.S. Open. Yeah, she's a U.S. Open champion and great swing. And we noticed in the counter her time, but what we noticed is that it took her 27 frames of backswing, and then we noticed it took her 9 frames of downswing, which no big deal. Everybody's got their own tempo. It should be slow. It should be rhythmical, right? Well, then cut to Tiger Woods when he won the 97 Masters by like 50 shots. And guess what his tempo was? It was 27 frames in the back and 9 frames down. And so my dad all of a sudden thought, oh my gosh, everyone's got 27.9. We just can't see it. Well, that wasn't it. It was the 3-1. And then what it also was, guess what? If a guy's 24.8 or 21.7, that's about 1 second from takeaway back to impact. And that broke every rule we'd been told growing up, that you had to swing slow and smooth and all these things. These guys were about 1 second from takeaway to impact. Jan and Tiger at the time were 1.2 seconds. So the way this developed into distance and became a distance thing is that when you take someone that's swinging, let's say their elapsed time from takeaway to impact is 1.5, 1.6, or 2 seconds even, and you take that and you cut that time frame down to 1 second, the pure physics of it tell you they're going to swing faster clubhead speed because they're traveling the same amount of distance in way less time. So all of a sudden, people were coming to our golf schools for tempo and rhythm, and they were hitting the ball 20 yards farther. And I'm not talking like weeks or months or any of this. I'm talking like in 10 swings. 10 swings later, they're adding 20 yards to their drives. And back then, launch monitors were just coming around and all these things, but I always wanted to have one because I always wanted to see my speeds. And you'd see these incredible jumps in speed right away. So tempo and speed were really linked. And it's what you talked about earlier. It's also part of that intensity, that effort to do what it takes to swing faster. You have to put more force into the grip, more force into the ground. So you do these other good things as well. But that's how it got started. And the other nice thing about it, or fun thing about it, is that it's fairly easy. There's these 3 tones we play, and I can play those here in a second, but it's not real complicated. You just swing faster and swing to these 3 tones, and good things will happen.
Yeah. And just to break down a couple of things you said there. So the increasing of speed, we're looking at the formula speed equals distance over time. Like, that's obviously basic physics. We've probably all learned that, some of us a few years before others, but it's the simple formula of the speed equation. Then when you're talking frames, you're talking in terms of frames within a second of a video. So
correct. Yeah.
How did you actually have that back then? Because obviously iPhones weren't, humming around back then. So how did that come about? Because you would have had some sort of like DSLR set up and...
That's right. And when we were looking at the video counter, I believe, so we knew there was 30 frames per second. And I believe when we were kind of sitting there with the video editor, we were talking about her, it looked like, this was at the 1.24 second mark of the video or whatever, 1 minute, 30 seconds or whatever. But for whatever reason, we started thinking in frames per second. And that's what led to this discovery. There was actually some other data out at the time that talked about tour pros, average swing times and things like that, but they weren't looking at frames per second. So it was a little harder to see that 3-to-1. And everything was just so based on this idea that everyone had, like, tempo is your own special, you get to have your own tempo. We're all individual. And yes, you are somewhat, but it'd almost be like saying to an athlete, hey, like, you're an athlete because this is your world. Can you ever imagine saying to a track and field runner or a pro football player or a pro basketball player, hey, since you're a real laid back person, you should run slow? That's not how it works, right? It doesn't matter how laid back. I don't care what your personality is. If the sport requires speed and power, you need to have speed and power. And that's kind of what we found for tempo, that you may be late, you may be, boo weekly, but again, he had fast tempo, even though he was this slow moving guy. So you really need to do what the sport demands, not what your personality is wanting to give.
Yeah, 100%. I think that's why a lot of people get caught in the trap with training for golf. They're like, well, these are the specific demands of the game, like the golf swing, and the movement is rotary, and we need to do, create rotation and torque and stuff. And that's why they're like, oh, okay, like I'll go to the gym and I'll like create rotation and torque, and they just do all these like twisting exercises and rotations, and they wonder why it doesn't transfer to the game. But there's other ways in which we can, induce those adaptations. But can you share like a story or a couple of stories, maybe of a pro or just some other users of the app? Because I know there's been, like over 100,000 people have used the app now, and
yeah, I don't know the exact number. I know it's a lot of downloads over the years because the app's been out for a good 10, 15 years. We've had a bunch of different tour pros using it. One of my favorite guys is Padraig Harrington. He's used all my tools. And if you look at his swing over the years, his tempo has gotten so fast. It's incredible. He went from probably 24.8 to almost an 18.6. And so remember, when I say 18.6, that's 18 frames in the backswing, 6 on the downswing. If you had 18 plus 6, that's 24. Divide that by 30. That's talking from takeaway to impact, 0.8 of a second. So it's incredible kind of what he's done at that high level. And then obviously, like you said, tens and thousands of average golfers have used it. I think it might be good to just bring up these tones that I'm talking about on the app, so people can kind of get an idea of what it sounds like. If you see right there, there's the main screen. And if I just go to, like, say Rory McIlroy or Tiger in most of his career, you hear these 3 tones: start, top, impact. And it doesn't sound that crazy fast, you and I listening to it, but when you kind of close your eyes or you get up to a golf ball and feel that, it's really incredibly fast. And what's cool about the human body and the human brain is that we adapt. Again, we talked about earlier, that's how we work. And so a lot of people are out there driving a Mack truck and they're driving it down the road, and then they get in a Ferrari and they're all over the road. And that's what happens when you first try tour tempo and try to swing faster, is that it'll feel reckless and crazy, but eventually that'll feel normal, right? It's the first time you do anything as an athlete or a golfer, it feels different. But the other thing to remember as well is that if you're 24.8 or 21.7, it's not necessarily the goal in life to get to 18.6. You can find which tempo works best for you, and that's what you want to use, because golf is very easy to see the results. You've got launch monitors, you've got your score, everything is very data driven. Find what works for you. We do have the 5 different flavors. So it's such a cool thing because your listeners can get the app, go out to the driving range right now, they can try it, they can change their tempo. It's really hard to change your change your body, change all these things, change your hip, speed, or your this and that. Those things are tough to do in golf. And that's why you get paid the big bucks to do what you do with golfers, because those things are hard to do. But your tempo is really easy to change. And it's just this untapped fountain of power that people can use to make a quick change and find out what works best for you. Is your current tempo good? It might be, but it might be that you want to mess around with these tempos and find the one that works really well for you.
Yep. And then, so when someone's going away and, starting to implement the tour tempo and try and get to that 3-to-1 ratio, what aspects and what sort of journey can you expect them or tell them that they'll probably go on? Because obviously you're saying that when you start out, you're probably going to hit the hosel a few times because you're just thinking about the tempo so much and you're going to expect some things to happen. What can you expect to happen initially? And then how should that look? Like what would, sort of linear sort of progress look like for someone?
That is a great question. So this is what I tell people when you start. We do have a free app out there called the Tour Tempo Frame Counter. I recommend getting that app. Just get an idea of what your tempo is now. You can count your frames, see where you are. If you're 38.12, strap yourself in because you're about to have, it's going to be a mind-blowing experience. If you're 23-7, it's not going to be so mind-blowing, but it'll be, it'll be cool to do. The very first thing that I want the people to do, and the hardest part of tour tempo, is learning to start your swing to that first tone. Most people, when they get up to hit a golf ball, they're just going to kind of waggle in and swing. No one's ever put a gun to your head and said, swing, swing. So you have to learn to sort of dance with those tones. That's why I recommend, if possible, have somebody with you so you both can hear those tones and see if you're starting correctly on that first tone. And then also, I don't recommend hitting a golf ball to start when you first start the tones. Just make practice swings. Hit a tee, hit a divot, hit anything in the ground. Once you feel relatively comfortable swinging to whatever tones you decide to start with, and if you have no clue what to do, just start with 24/8. If it's way too slow, you can speed up to 21/7. If it's way too fast, you can slow down a bit to 27/9. But after you make a few practice swings and you feel like you've got this, now let's go to a golf ball. And like you said, let's not judge the results of the ball. Let's just get our only goal in life is to, am I syncing up with these tones? So how am I syncing up with these tones? And that's where my mindset is, and my awareness is on the tones. And if you do that within 10, 15, 20 swings, you're going to start to find like, okay, I'm starting to sink into this. And like I said, for some people, it's going to be a mind-blowing aha moment, and they're going to just be so happy because they'll hit the ball farther and do all this, and they won't believe how fast it feels. For others, it will be this feeling of, wow, I can kind of dial in, not have to think 50 different swing thoughts because I'm only focused on these tones. But it is a little bit different for everybody, and it is something that you have to work your way in and not judge that golf ball in the beginning.
Yeah, 100%. One of the guys who I've had on a couple of times is Dr. Luke Benoit, who's a PhD in motor learning. I'm sure you've heard of him, the Ripstick founder.
Sure. Yeah.
And yeah, he talks about when we're trying to implement swing changes or trying to implement things like this, where we're changing fundamentally parts of our swing. We've got two masters. Like one is like obviously the swing change and how it feels, and then the other is like where the ball goes. So he's a big proponent of doing, he calls them freezes and other things that are motor learning type terms, to actually learn the movement without a golf ball, then to do it with a foam ball. So you've got some sort of target there while you're thinking about the internal things. And then obviously once it's a bit more ingrained, like you're saying, then step to the real ball and, then determine success of it by obviously the two things, the two masters, like ball flight, obviously, and also if you're matching up with the frames per second that you're trying to go for. So it sounds like a good, structured approach and similar to what he's talking about. So
exactly. Yeah, I found that's, I 100% agree with that. The other thing I'll mention while we're doing that is you don't have to be perfect. That's the cool thing about this. So if your tempo is 22/7 or 27 or 19/6 or 25/8 or 26/8, those are all fine. It's not like having 24/8 makes it special and better. We just want you in this realm. There's a guy from Yale, he was the head of physics at Yale, Dr. Robert Grober, and he did a study, it's out there, called the Mechanical Understanding of Tempo in the Golf Swing. And he took, at the time, he was doing 240 frames per second. And he found that tour pros were between 2.5 and 3.5 to 1, with the average being 3 to 1. So he backed up all of our research. But he kind of showed you, or kind of in his research, like, hey, it doesn't have to be perfect. And that's what I found myself. It's as long as you're within that realm. Now, if you're, let's say you're, 36/12 or, even worse, like, 42/12 or whatever, that's just taking so much time. There's too much elapsed time there. So you're really missing out. And if you're, let's say, 29/7, your backswing is just too slow. It doesn't really match the downswing. So doesn't have to be perfect. It's another nice thing about this whole learning experience. Just get it in the ballpark.
Yeah. Then just to slightly go off there, obviously with fitness, we deal with, the John Daly question. And in recent times, it was, Charlie Hull coming out and saying that she doesn't do any golf fitness and she just enjoys running and you don't need to do golf fitness. You would have your equivalent of this, which is the Hideki Matsuyama, the Siwoo Kims, like all these guys. So how do you address those things when people bring those up? Because I'm sure you've heard them. You're already nodding and said, yeah, so that's a thing, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing I would say when I look at these guys is they all hit it plenty far enough. That's number one. And the average golfer, as you know, does not. Number two, they've got perfect mechanics. Like Hideki, Colin, Cameron Young, their mechanics are unbelievable. Watch them frame by frame, they're perfect. The average golfer does not have good mechanics. Not at all, right? The
No,
other thing is there's video of Hideki out there when he went over 190 ball speed. Guess what he did to do it? He sped up his tempo. So
massively. Yeah.
they're if they did want to hit farther, they could speed up their tempo and do it. So they've got perfect mechanics. They hit the ball far enough. They're getting the results they want. Okay, and they've got their tempo. Now, I would argue most golfers have tried slow tempo like that. So my whole thing, I used to be very. I used to be very militant about this, like, no, you cannot absolutely do that, okay? But I've changed to this. That's great that we got these guys out there and you think about that. But try tour tempo. Just see what the results are. Because my question to you would be, or to any golfer, if you're completely happy with the results you have and totally, with the results you have now and satisfied with your golf, great, you're good. I've yet to meet a golfer that's completely happy and satisfied with where they are with their golf game. I don't know about you. Maybe Tiger Woods in the year 2000, everyone, Scotty Scheffler last year. Other than that, everyone else wants to get better. And if you want to get better, you got to try these things. But yeah, that would be my main thing is these guys have perfect mechanics, hit the ball far enough, and they really are kind of where they need to be. You as the listener out there, you just need to try these different tempos to find out. And it's such an easy ask. The app's a one-time fee. It's so easy to change tempo. It's not like changing your grip or even your backswing or whatever. It's just such an easy ask, an easy thing to do.
Yeah, 100%. And I mean, we can look as hard and far as we want in fitness and in, tempo to find these outliers,
Yeah.
but
Oh, exactly. Yeah.
they are just that. They are literally just that. You're literally clutching at straws to name like a few guys on tour, whereas like Yale University study finding like the majority of tour professionals swing 2.5 to 3 seconds per backswing. It's like it's overwhelming
2.5
data
to
in
3.5 ratio,
yeah.
not seconds.
Sorry, yeah,
Yeah.
ratio of 1 second, yeah. And then, so we're looking far and wide for these like specific examples. And it's like, do you want to spend your time looking for the example so that you can make an excuse for yourself? Or would you rather just actually try the thing and see what it does with the majority of people doing it? And I don't mean to say like, if everyone else is jumping off a cliff, you should do it too. But also if they're all getting results and they're the results which you want, then stop looking for ways in which that it won't work for you. Like that's a
Exactly.
really
100%. Yeah.
it's a big thing in fitness. And I think also in potentially implementing something like this as well. So
I love your
yeah,
example there. I never thought of it in those terms of fitness, and I never knew that about Charlie Hull. But I mean, for every Charlie Hull and John Daly, there's like a million golfers that don't work out that is really hurting their game. And
yeah,
it's the same thing with like Hideki or Colin. For every one of those guys, there's a million golfers with that slow tempo that's absolutely killing their game. So yeah, that's a great example. One thing I wonder if we could jump on, it's something you mentioned earlier, because I have sort of, and I'm sure your listeners want to hit the ball farther. And you mentioned something that I wrote about in my book called Tour Tempo Force. And you said something about the hips, thoracic, and shoulders. And what I've found is this. This is sort of an ironclad deal for the listener out there to hit the ball farther. Here it is. If I can get more load in my hips, shoulders, thoracic, or hips, thoracic, and shoulders, and I also include wrist in there, okay? So there's four things I can load. If I can get more load in those and do it in less time, I'm batting 1,000 as a coach. It's absolutely positively guaranteed you will increase your swing speed and hit the ball farther. And it will feel effortless because you're not doing it by trying to swing harder. You're doing it by sort of winding up the spring with greater capacity. Hips, thoracic, shoulders, or wrist, do it in less time, or do more load in the same amount of time you're taking now. You're going to gain speed and it's going to feel effortless. Now, how do you do that? Well, part of it would be getting into the gym, making sure those things work really well, right? Because a big one for me is your humerus. If you can get your lead humerus up in the air, sort of think of a Justin Thomas or a John Daly or any long hitter, that's going to give you more power or more potential for speed. Now, how do you do that? Well, the lat's going to have to loosen up to be able to do that. You're going to have to do certain exercises. But this is sort of where the worlds of fitness and tempo blend together, because if you can increase the load in one of those four sources and do it in less time, it's just amazing what that's done. I've taken my own speed from probably about 190 miles per hour to over 200 by increasing all four of those and doing it in about the same or slightly less time. So That's a great thing you mentioned earlier, and it's something every golfer should be working towards, especially the type of listener that you're going to have on this podcast, is combine that with tempo for an incredible result.
Yeah, 100%. And just for the listeners there, when we talk about getting requisite mobility in those areas, so TPI, this is a TPI study, and what we actually assess during the TPI assessment is that we want 60 degrees of internal, external rotation through the hips. So 60 degrees so you can actually turn into the backswing and not have to sway to create that loading into the trail hip. We want 45 degrees of thoracic rotation. People get bent around the axles with that because 45 degrees is not much. It's literally about that much if you're watching the podcast, or it's not very far. Think of a torch shining out from straight in the middle of your chest, and you're trying to turn it from directly in front of you out 45 degrees, not 90 degrees. And then with the shoulders, we want our trail shoulder as whatever hand golfer we are, right-handed, right arm, we want that to be 90 degrees. So our forearm to rotate to in line with our spine angle or greater. If we can do all of those three things, and then wrist, most golfers don't have wrist issues unless they have, plates and screws and, all that sort of, they've had it welded back together from a surgeon. So it's not a huge thing. People can mainly move the wrist in the required angles, but if we can move those three things, the next part to it is having strength through that range of motion. Because if we think about, a ballerina, for example, they can move like a dancer, they can move to all of these really excessive ranges of motion. But if we loaded their body with external weight in those positions, they may not get injured because they are athletes. But if someone had the flexibility that they did and we loaded it, they would get hurt. So we can't go loading the body in the golf swing in those positions if we don't have strength there. So we need motion, range of motion, we need strength in that range of motion, and then we can start thinking about creating force with that. So just to give people like a rough idea of the ranges of motion we're looking for and why we need that, it's exactly so that we can load into those positions. Because when we go into loading those positions, putting more than the force that we normally do, like when we're running, everyone's heard 2 times, 3 times, 4 times the normal force through each leg of your body weight going through it. It's the same with all these joints. They need to have the capacity to handle that.
That's awesome. That's great stuff. It's exactly that's why Charlie Hull and John Daly are outliers.
Yeah. And John Daly, maybe, like, he's in hospitals getting surgeries all the time now.
True.
Like Charlie Hull, like there's so many videos on the internet of her doing like literally golf specific work, and she works with a trainer who's a golf specific person. So her to come out and say that, I think, was just like an offhand comment on an Instagram story, and everyone's sort of taken to it. It was good, it was good for content and engagement for me to make a post about it. So
there you go.
I'll run with it. An interesting thing there was your journey. So obviously I waffled on a tangent, but with your journey, you've gone from, we're talking ball speed, we're not talking clubhead speed.
Right.
If you could swing at 190, that'd be great. That'd be a new world record. But ball speed 190 to 200, what had you done in order to get to 190 in the past? Because that's an extremely good ball speed. And then to go to the next level of 200, like what took you to there, and then what took you to the next level?
Keep in mind a couple things on that that I'll preface it all with is that I'm in my mid 50s. I'm about 6 foot. You met me. I'm not a big guy. So I'm using a lot of leverage in my swing. I think one of the things that got me to that 190 was changing the way that I worked out as far as all kinds of different stuff. And you mentioned a little bit earlier, like I quit jogging, I started sprinting. For my weightlifting, I made it more about the intensity, heavier weights, safer ranges of motion when I did it because I'm older. Less about, like you said, it didn't have to be about rotation stuff. I didn't do much rotation stuff because you're already doing rotation when you hit. The spine doesn't love rotation anyway, so you don't want to do a ton of rotation work as a golfer. That depends on a lot of variables, right? But if you're hitting balls and whatnot, it's to me, it's more about the power elements than it is about the rotation. So that was what I did for my body. Tempo wise, I did what we talked about just earlier. I tried to get a little more load into those segments and keep that tempo the same. And then for taking it to that next level, what I started really working on was in the swing. I started to add more power elements to the workouts, like throwing a medicine ball or things like that. But then I also, in the swing, started to work on really creating moment arms, really creating moments of inertia, really looking at ground force, center of mass, grip pressure, and even lengthening the swing a touch more. So it's a pretty long swing.
Yeah, I saw the video.
Yeah, and what's cool though is that when I want to dial it back, like when I dial it back to, let's just say, just past parallel, it's still about 190, 192, and so that's what's great. I mean, you know this. So this is one of the big things we talk about as speed guys. If we raise that ceiling, your 80%, your 90, 80 to 90% swing is going to raise as well. And that's what golfers are looking for. But those would be a bunch of the things I really worked on. Also, like I said earlier, I'm very big on the resistance thing. I've got a couple of devices I've developed and worked and used that really give you resistance at the right places in the golf swing to wake some muscles up and wake with the right mechanics at the same time.
Yeah, nice. I love a lot of what you said there because going away from, like, I talk to so many golfers who want to add cardio in, and I think there's this, there's this element to, like, obviously feeling like you need it, obviously, to walk the course because people get tired and they think that obviously doing something that's harder than walking the course will get them to be better at that. There's probably some truth to that, and there is a little bit of an element of they're able to recover faster. We know that better VO2 max allows for faster recovery between sets and bouts of different things, and obviously replenishment of ATP and whatever else. But when we talk about golf, it's repeated efforts of power-based activities, which is a sprint interval type setup or a weightlifting setup, like do 5 and then rest for a little bit, do 5 then rest for a little bit. So golf is the same, particularly if you're having 80 to 100 shots. For most golfers, what's the average handicap? 14. So they're probably having 85 to 95 shots for most golfers when they play around. 70, 75, or what's that, like 60 to 65 of them are probably, pretty all-out shots, hitting long irons, fairway woods, drivers, all that type of stuff, and then a few chips and a lot of putts, maybe 30, right, 35 putts around. So there's a lot of, power-based output there. And then also, so obviously when we just said that is replacing running with sprinting, which is great. The other thing you mentioned is the ground reaction force that you're trying to increase. So TPI studied it, and they say all pro golfers, like all PGA Tour pros that are excelling, can all have a vertical leap of 20 inches or above, because in the kinematic sequence, we need to have the ground being the main force center driving into the ground for it to then transfer through the whole kinematic sequence into the club head. If we don't have that pressure down, then that speed doesn't come out the club, or we're really limiting how much power can go through that club if we're not using the legs.
Greg just updated those numbers at the TPI Summit. The new average now is it's over 24 inches.
Woo!
And the LPGA Tour is up to, I believe, almost 20. And
yeah, wow.
he updated all those numbers at the summit, and they've all really increased. It's pretty amazing. And I believe, don't quote me on this, but I believe the average ground force on the PGA Tour is over, the peak ground force is over like 210, 220, 220%. So that's weight, really, yeah. And if you look at the ball speeds, I mean, it's amazing. You turn it on a Saturday, any day of the week on a PGA Tour. So many guys are upper 170s, low 180s now. It's incredible how that's really increased. But yeah, all those numbers have really increased. So it's pretty amazing.
Yeah, that's cool. I didn't realize that the numbers had increased, say, up to 24 inches. They had the TPI Summit last October, didn't they? So
yeah,
a few months ago they released that.
Yeah.
That's cool. They need to update their website because that's what
they do. They need to update, and I think that was just based on the last few years. Like he took the average of the last few years, not like the last 10 years, but just like the last few years, and saw how that has increased. The other crazy thing, I mean, just if we're talking in terms of the last few years, going back to tempo, is the John Rahms, Tony Finau's. There's so many guys now that have incredibly fast tempo. It's pretty amazing. So it's just like everything else in golf. It's bigger, faster, stronger. And, that's what's really you're starting to see out there. Even Scotty Scheffler, who looks like he's really swinging slow, is still 24.8, which is faster than most golfers.
Yeah, and it's just going to get greater with all the kids coming out of college. Ludwig Aberg is one of my favorites. Like his swing it actually looks like a beautiful tempo, but he's
poster child for tour tempo. Yeah, he's just under 21.7. He's almost 18.6, but it just shows how you can have a super fast swing, great speed, and it doesn't look like it's jerky or anything like that. And that's kind of what the whole idea is with tour tempo, and he's got easy power.
Yeah. It doesn't help that he's 6 foot and a male model. Like he's just killing it. Killing it in every aspect of life, that guy. He didn't hit any ugly branches on the way out of the tree, that's for sure.
No, he's doing all right.
So, mate, looking ahead with tour tempo, like are there any, advancements or any changes that have happened over the years as you guys have, built out the app and how has it sort of progressed over time to what it is today? And what are you planning for the future for it? Like, where do you see it in the next few years?
Great question. We started with the 3-to-1, and then we looked at short game, and that was more of a 2-to-1. It's more of a pendulum driven by gravity. So when you're looking at the short game, it's sort of driven by the same amount of force back and through, and that's a 2-to-1 ratio. And so we've added that. Also on the app, we've added these songs in there as well. So you've got, we call them tracks, and it basically is music where you can choose so that's 21/7, dun, 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 dun. And so we've added those songs as well. They're a little bit harder to hit to, but they're great to listen to if you want to listen to them. We've added focus songs. I'm actually just now working on some new tones as well with less reaction time. We have reaction time built into the tone, so I'm working on new tones to go in there. And we're also Apple Watch. We're going to have the new Apple Watch app is coming out probably in the next month or two, and that will have vibrations in it. So you've heard it all first on this podcast, but yeah, all that stuff is
Awesome.
Coming soon. We think that'll be good for golfers. Just another way to, instead of being auditory, it's going to be kinesthetic, and so that's some stuff that's coming around the bend.
Yeah, cool. I love the short game one. Is that short game as in chipping and putting, or is it just chipping? Tell us about
Correct.
that.
So most normal short game shots, chipping, pitching, and putting, those would all be the 2-to-1, and so those are going to look like this, and you'd have like an 18-9 start, top, impact. So it's a little less, there's more time on the downswing. Short game is about distance control, and obviously accuracy is at a huge premium. And so people love the short game tones. They're great for putting. And we say short game, but really they're putting also, and they're really great to dial that in. I think a lot of times, you can see a lot of different variety. Putting is definitely a science, but it's also it's big time an art. And too many people get tied up with putting thoughts as well. And so sometimes going to the bump, 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 that's a great way to get rid of the thoughts while you're putting.
Yeah, 100%. I think I think with short game as opposed to, driver and irons and stuff or, putting, I think short game people get really caught up in decelling into the ball and they hit a lot of flubs and fat shots or thin it through the green, like all these sort of like really bad things that they don't want to be doing. I think having a tempo there, or I don't think, I can see how having a tempo there to actually be accelerating into the ball when they're trying to meet that tempo of actually getting back to the ball, like that bump, 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 is actually going to get them accelerating into it and keep that speed into the ball. What sort of things do you see or have you heard from people with that? Like they start making better contact with it, they're actually not fatting any shots near the green. Is that sort of stuff improved or?
Absolutely. All the above. I think, you mentioned decelerating and accelerating. You really don't want to do a lot of either when you're putting or chipping and things. You don't want to decel and you also don't want to have a burst of energy. And so what the tones do is they give you this rhythm and this mindset of a pendulum that, hey, it's sort of a pendulum going back and through. And yes, there's more speed at the bottom, but we're not really just trying to accelerate the hell out of it either. And so it gives your brain these places in space and time for the club to be. And that really helps the body sort of organize itself to find these spots. Obviously, low point control is huge because that's going to determine your impact. But tempo is so important to add to that so that you're not trying to rush or slow down. You know when and where you should be. And our brain is so good at adapting to music and sounds. If I tell you to swing slower or faster, what does that mean? Or if I say, hey, you're decelerating, then you're going to try to do the opposite of that. And so it's a lot easier to just go to these guardrails, I call them, bump, bump, bump. And that way we both are speaking the same language, and that's the language our body speaks when we hit a ball. The body doesn't use verbal, the body doesn't move with verbal cues as far as that's not where the movements come from. So when you're doing something athletic, you've got to speak that language that the body is using, and that's what these tones do.
Yeah. Cool, I love it. And then the next thing I want to know is obviously you're a very I don't even know how to describe it, but you just love to dive into like the why behind things, right? And I would have loved to have met your dad because I'm assuming he is the one who sort of instilled this in you.
Sure.
What sort of lessons or things do you remember picking up from him that have led you to become this type of person who, you know, wants to like dive into all the science behind the tour tempo and take the the hours of research and study and development of it all? Like, what things did you pick up from him that have led you to be like this essentially?
I think a huge one is curiosity. He was
Yeah.
always so curious of what would happen if I did this, what would happen if I did that.
Mm.
The huge curiosity, also open-mindedness. You've got to have an open mind to take in new things and expand and do things. And so we had this incredible curiosity, this incredible open-mindedness, willingness to experiment. We're all in of one, we're all in of one. And he did all his experimentation on me. And I have, yeah, I mean, I have two younger brothers, but I was sort of the one that, I was the guinea pig.
Yeah.
But yeah, curiosity and open-mindedness were two of his big ones. And then he was really good at instilling on me, especially it took me a long time to figure this out, but this non-judgmentalism of, hey, this is sort of the Thomas Edison thing of, the 10,000 ways it didn't work for the light bulb, but we tried this and that didn't work, but don't judge it, don't get down on it. That means we're one step closer to finding a way. For every no, you're one step closer to a yes, so to speak. That was something. And he had an infectious positivity and enthusiasm as well that I think all golfers need.
Yeah.
Because if you don't, this game will really beat you up. So I think he that was something that always came through with him. And he was a coach. He was a high school football. He played college football, and he was a high school coach as well. So he always had a coach's mentality with us, and I think that's something important for golfers, not only to find in their own coach, but to have this kindness and coaching mindset for their own game. Because if you tell yourself you suck or you're bad or you can't do this or that, golf will make that come true. And what he always did was he had this coaching mindset of, hey, like I said, let's try this. Let's do it this way. We can do it. We'll find a way. And that was what was really great about him. I appreciate you asking about him. But yeah, and everyone loved my dad. He was a great man. He didn't grow up playing golf, and he became he got to where he could break par or shoot par later in life, just kind of digging it out of the dirt himself. So
Wow.
those are big things for all golfers to really, that I would encourage golfers to do is be open-minded, be curious, and don't beat yourself up.
Yeah, I love it. It's being a dad myself, I'm really interested in people like yourself who have this non-dogmatic approach to a lot of things, and you're very open-minded, curious. You're quick not to judge certain situations, scenarios, or people for things because the guy who cuts you off in traffic, like he could be having the worst day of his life,
That's
and
right.
all he's done is cut you off. It's really easy to go to the horn and, flip him the bird and all those things. But it's like, did it really affect you that much, from that standpoint? But also from hearing a lot of noise these days for kids. Like my son's going to grow up in an age of social media where he's got thousands of inputs to him every single day through external sources to shape his opinions, views, and thoughts. To have this sort of a mindset around it is going to be extremely important. But I appreciate you sharing that about him. And then the last thing I want to finish on is what advice would you give to, young golfers, coaches, people just starting out with tour tempo, when it is tough at the start and they are, like you were saying before, like one of 10,000 ways that it won't work, like to stick with it and to stick with the process of it working. What advice would you give to them?
I think the biggest thing is you need to, and this is true in any endeavor, like where are you right now? Let's figure out where you are right now. Let's look at your tempo. That frame counter app we have out there is free. You can find your tempo out. Let's discover your tempo. If it's really slow, man, we got to try this. We got to do this. Let's put some effort in and see what happens. And the other big thing, and this goes back to a little bit about what I talked about with my dad, and we talked about it, and you mentioned the motor learning guy. Like, let's not judge it. Let's give ourselves a break. Let's try this and see if we can do this correctly. And once we can, now let's bring in the ball. Let's bring in the consequence and do it that way. I think that's the biggest thing, is to experiment, get it to where you like it, and then go to try it. And then the other thing I'll mention that I didn't bring up before, and this is kind of getting granular, but when you're doing the tones, it can be very helpful to do a pre-shot routine or to waggle to the tones. We did a video of Sam Snead back in the day, and it's a perfect 21-7, but what's incredible is that he actually waggled to the tones. Like his waggle was the tempo of his golf swing. Wow. So that's something great. I mean, how many golfers, probably know this, I'm sure. I can tell you a good golfer by their waggle or by their setup or the way they approach the ball, right? You can see it right away. And so, like I said, it's getting a little deep into the weeds, but start waggling to your tempo, and that will help you to feel that rhythm. And then when you want to use it, it's going to be part of it. And the big bonus to all this is less thinking. That'll make the game more fun.
Yeah. I love it. I'll go one step further. I can tell you how good someone's going to be from looking at how they approach the ball from 50 or 100 meters away on the range. If they approach it from behind with a clear target in mind and, going through a pre-shot routine, I can tell you that they're probably a low single-digit handicapper or, single-digit at least. If they're just, scraping and smacking them, then I'll tell you they're probably higher than that.
Yeah, I mean, you can spot it right away, right? Especially if the body's kind of hunched over or this or that and all these different things. So yeah, it's really important to learn to have a pre-shot routine that matches the rhythm of what you're about to do.
Cool, mate. Well, thanks so much. I really appreciate your time. I'm sure the listeners have gained so much about, tour tempo, what it is, how they can implement it, to stick with it. See it out. Don't just bloody give up after you hit one hosel rocket. Stick to it. Stick with the process. It is going to get better. And like you said, it's, adapting to that the new swing speed change. Like it's an increase in speed for a lot of people. It's going to be, but just think of the results if you stick with it for any period of time. Like obviously you're going to start to see that ball flying further. And the beautiful thing about golf, as opposed to many other sports, is we can all hit one shot that looks exactly like Tiger Woods would hit it, and that's what's going to keep us going back. So hold on to those thoughts, hold on to them as tightly as you can, and remember them, and don't remember all the others. Mate, thank you again. Where can people go to find out more about you, more about Tour Tempo, and dive into more of your content?
Yeah, sure thing. You can go to tourtempo.com. It's going to have information on the app, information on some of my training aids. I also have a new, I call it the Tour Tempo Masterclass, is there as well. And then on the social, it's at Tour Tempo on Instagram and Twitter. So yeah, there's definitely find me, reach out to me if you have questions. And I'll get back to everybody. And I'll say one last thing, because you mentioned Tiger. You can hit a ball like Tiger. Well, guess what else you can do? You can have Tiger's tempo, and it's really cool to try. You can't have his body, which granted his body is a little messed up these days, but
yeah.
You can't have Rory's body, but you can have Rory's tempo. So it's really cool to kind of think that I can't have maybe their swing, but I can have their tempo, and what will that do for me? So think about that.
Oh, cool, mate. Thanks so much. I appreciate it.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Shaun. Appreciate it.